Carlisle began life as Luguvalium, a Roman settlement that grew out of the fort on the site. Its next name, Caerluel, the fortified place belonging to Luel, gives us the beginnings of the name Carlisle. Vikings captured the town in 876 before the Saxons then took it in the 10th century. Over time it took on strategic importance for its location near the Scottish border. After all, before 1092 Carlisle was in Scotland, but with so many clashes between the Scots and the English, not to mention the tensions caused by the Border Reivers, it's safe to say Carlisle has a tumultuous history. And as I'm sure you've noticed by now with these city folklore episodes, where a city has history, it has legends. So let's explore some of Carlisle's legends, ghost stories and just plain bizarre tales in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We're going to dive into this week's episode, and I think I mentioned last time I wasn't sure if we were going to look at Carlisle or Durham. And the more I looked at it, Durham is cool, and it does have some cool stuff going on with it. But I think because of the fact that obviously my episode next week is going to be Sunderland, I thought, well, I'll spread the northern cities out a little bit, because we've already done Sheffield, we've done York, let's go over to the northwest and let's do Carlisle instead. So Carlisle is quite interesting because of the fact that obviously it's like the other city along with Newcastle that's kind of near Hadrian's Wall. So I think that then obviously we've had connections between the two cities and so on as well. So I thought it was quite nice to stretch a welcoming hand across to our western neighbours. And we're going to start off with the walled up woman of Carlisle Castle. And Carlisle Castle is a very cool site if you are looking for somewhere to go and visit. It's currently run by English Heritage. And it stands on the site of the original Roman fort, which supported garrisons along Hadrian's Wall. And William II took over the site and built the first version of the castle, because obviously whenever you look at a castle, you're not looking at what it was originally designed to look like. You're usually looking at just the latest iteration of it. And Carlisle Castle is no exception, because King David of Scotland took Carlisle in 1135 and he actually built the keep. Later kings added to the castle over time, which is very much necessary by Carlisle sitting on that Anglo-Scots border. And apparently the Scots actually laid siege to the castle 7 times between 1173 and 1461. Now the castle also became important during the 15th and early 16th centuries, during the breakdown of law along the border, which gave rise to the Border Reivers. Carlisle Castle was the administrative centre for the West March, and basically what they did was they divided the region along the border into 3, and the West March was the one furthest to the west, as you've probably worked out yourself. And I will at some point do something on the Border Reivers, because I think that they're not necessarily as well known as they probably should be. It's a very strange period of history, but anyway, that is for a future episode. For our purposes here, Carlisle Castle was both a prison for Border Reivers and it was also home to Mary Queen of Scots in 1567. So with such a violent history, it's hardly surprising that construction work turned up a body bricked into a second floor wall in the keep in 1835. And according to the legend, she was still wearing the tattered remains of her dress. Some say it was made of silk. Somebody said silk tartan, which I thought was an interesting combination. And she apparently still had 3 rings on the bones of her fingers. I did read one article where someone claimed she was also holding a child, but that one literally only ever appeared once, and that's not like a common thread among these stories. So basically, woman walled up in the wall, still wearing her jewellery and her dress. To this day, nobody knows who she was or why she was in the wall, although most people assume that she must have been walled up alive, because why else would you be there? But it seems that she wasn't happy to rest easily, unfortunately. So in 1842, obviously 7 years later, a soldier sat at his post at the castle, because this is when it did still actually have a regiment there. And he was passing the time while on guard duty in the early hours of the morning. And if you've ever had to do anything in the early hours of the morning, you know how utterly boring it is, but how everything just seems a little bit weird, because it's kind of the time we're not used to being awake. Well, he's sitting there passing the time and a spectral woman appeared, drifting towards him. The soldier challenged her, obviously didn't really know what on earth to make of her, but his duty involved challenging people who had no right to be there. When she completely ignored him, he charged her with his bayonet. Now, the woman responded by simply vanishing in front of him, which, as party tricks go, is a pretty cool one. But the soldier, unfortunately, actually died of shock several hours later. Now, most sources will draw a direct line between the discovery of the skeleton and the appearance of the woman, although with 7 years between the two, I'm a little bit wondering about the lack of other sightings. Although with ghosts, obviously, there is a possibility that she was appearing all the time. There was just no one there to see them. But this is the one that's been recorded. It is the main ghost story recited about the spectre, so it's unclear if she still stalks the castle or if nobody notices now because there's just nobody there at night to see her wandering about. But that is quite a famous story about Carlisle Castle. The other thing that you come across quite a lot when you look at Carlisle and ghost stories in particular is Carlisle Station. And some websites will even say it's the most haunted station in the country. And I would dispute that. But for our purposes, we'll have a look at it because it does still sound weird, if nothing else. The reason actually why I would dispute it is because trying to find anything about the ghost is really difficult because all the websites use the same description that came from an article in 2010. Now, the original article is no longer on the newspaper's website. You actually have to find it through Wayback Machine. But this one article in 2010 talks about the fact that 3 of the station managers were going to undertake a vigil in the Undercroft, which is this network of rooms beneath platform 1 of the station. So it's quite difficult when everybody is essentially quoting the same material because you think, well, surely if it was as haunted as everyone says it is, there would be other things written about it before 2010, considering the fact that the station has been there since 1847. You would think there would be more records, but that's probably me just being picky and wanting more records to look at. Now, if the Undercroft is haunted, it wouldn't be surprising, and there are pictures on some of these different websites that I found, and it does look creepy as anything. If you've ever had the chance to have a look in the vaults under London Bridge, like, they are creepy as anything, because I went in them once for an event years and years ago. It's kind of the same vibe, so they look like they should be haunted. But the site itself would also contribute towards that because the authorities built the station on land that was reclaimed by clearing the slums, and the land was actually called the Fever Pit. So the station staff then went on to use the rooms for a range of uses. So apparently at one point it was staff accommodation, which must have been horrible given there's no windows. They used it for storage, which makes sense. And one room apparently is even set up as a butcher's room. So they must have also rented the spaces out as well. Although I can imagine that actually making sense because it was probably quite cool down there. Now, the station managers did describe the unfriendly atmosphere in the Undercroft, explaining that many people wouldn't go into certain parts of the space. Remember, if you have somewhere that looks creepy, you will start to imagine things in it. And I'm saying this as someone who does believe in ghosts. I just want to put that out there as a remember, sometimes we can imagine things that aren't there. Now, the station manager, Sue Howarth, described, and I quote, reports of a headless man on platform 8, a veiled lady who walks the corridors, the pointing man in the Undercroft, and lights on the station that switch on at night, end quote. Now, all of that sounds really cool, and I would like to know more about all of them, particularly the veiled lady, because we all know how much I love my grey and white lady ghosts. But, yeah, so that's the sum total of what you can find about the ghosts that I could find anyway. So I went digging a little bit more because you know what I'm like. And in 2022, so obviously relatively recently, Avanti West Coast, who ran the station at the time, called in paranormal investigator Lewis Davison to find out what was going on beneath the station. And according to Davison, staff had told him that the Undercroft once housed bodies as a makeshift morgue following a train crash in 1915 near Gretna that killed over 200 people. So Davison reported some activity, particularly in the place where the bodies were stored, which might suggest some kind of paranormal presence, although it would obviously require much more further investigation. And I'm sitting there going, well, if anyone wants to let me have a bit poke round, I'd be more than happy to put my old paranormal investigator hat back on and go and have a look. But that's because I'm just really nosy. I am that person in a horror film who would hear a noise and go, what was that? And go towards it instead of away from it. But never mind. In 2017, Kimberly Watkin attempted to turn the Undercroft into a performance and arts venue after local students made use of the space for this reason, while plans were also mooted at one point to turn it into a railway museum. Now, I couldn't find any reports of the students experiencing anything odd, although it's possible that they did and it just wasn't recorded. But Watkins' comment that the space needed proper ventilation did make me wonder if there was actually a really boring, mundane explanation for the phenomena. If the air down there is particularly stale, if it's not nice to breathe, if it's just generally an unpleasant place to be in and it needs all of this modernisation, it could well be that there's actually a really dull explanation behind all of this. It could also be that it's just haunted as all hell. We don't know. But the one thing I thought was really interesting was when you then see the photos from 2022 from Davison's investigation, clearly none of that work has happened to turn the Undercroft into anything. So I think that must have come to nothing. And also, if you are interested in folklore and ghost stories related to stations on the railway in particular, I do have an entire bonus episode available to Patreon supporters on exactly that topic, and that is at the $3.50 a month or higher tier, along with the 50 odd other bonus episodes that there are now. Now, there were some other tales of hauntings. Most of these come from the paranormal database, so there's not a huge amount of information about each one, so I thought I would just put them all together in this one section. So an old woman apparently haunted a house in the Botcherby area in the 1960s, and she lived in a farm cottage at the top of a hill and was apparently famous in the area for always wearing old clothing, so the locals basically thought that she was quite poor. But then after she died, they discovered that she'd hidden £50,000 somewhere, which I can't quite work out which era she's from, because it sounded from the entry in Paranormal Database that she was haunting the house in the 60s, which meant she obviously predates that. But at any stage in history, £50,000 is a lot of money. And according to legend, her ghost appeared in a house built on the site of the cottage. Now, it could well be that if she has buried money or hidden money, she would then reappear, because obviously there's this whole idea with some ghosts that they can't lay to rest with this unfinished business, and one of them is, I need to tell someone where I've hidden this stuff. And you do get stories around this. We talked about it briefly in the Mega Meldon episode, the fact that she seemed to continue haunting until people managed to find what was left of her fortune. So it'd be interesting to know if she was still knocking about anywhere, this woman. Also from the mid-20th century, people saw a black shape walk through a wall at the Citadel restaurant before it then poured itself onto the ground. And I don't care who you are, that's just weird. That would be a weird thing to see. And I also want to include this one because it's a thing we've talked about before on the podcast, but a spectral cavalier also walks out of a wall on the west walls at dawn, and then he follows this really prescriptive route and then just vanishes when he reaches a particular set of steps. That to me sounds more like a residual haunting where he's basically reliving a routine because he did it so often in life, it's then become ingrained in death. And I have talked about Civil War ghosts before, as I say, but the presence of one in Carlisle does remind us that we don't just get these kind of ghosts, or particularly soldier ghosts, solely at battlefield sites. They can appear sort of anywhere as well. And obviously we have spectral cavaliers here in Newcastle as well, so I thought that was quite cool. And then, this is the cool thing about Carlisle, right? A lot of the stories that I found are actually from the 21st century, rather than necessarily really old legends. And obviously, as much as I love the old legends and the old folklore, it is really cool to look at things where it's like, God, that was only a few years ago. Now, this one's not a few years ago. I've done that thing where I'm like, 2007, that wasn't long ago. And then I'm like, hang on a minute, it actually was. But this one comes from September 2007. And a woman called Alison Marshall and her 4 children were living on Mardale Road. However, the events of just a week drove them from the house at 4 o'clock in the morning, because it seemed that small items had started moving across the rooms on their own. Apparently it was at the point where you could just sit there and watch stuff moving. Things were obviously getting thrown. Cold spots suddenly erupted around the building with no warning. They could hear a baby crying, and the youngest child was 3, so obviously there is a difference between a baby crying and a toddler crying, and there was inexplicable bangs during the night. So the family all basically left and went to Alison's mother's house, and they returned to the house during the day to find that doors that they had left closed were now open and objects had been moved. And basically Alison was too afraid to stay in the house at night based on how everything had ramped up seemingly out of nowhere, and to the point where she's like, no, I'm done. And both neighbours and Alison's mother put it down to something paranormal. And I think it was Alison's mother was like, I don't really want to say the P word, but like, it is basically a poltergeist. Like, that's the gist of what she said. And BBC Radio Cumbria's Emma Borthwick actually visited the house the same month. It seems like she must have been there like a week after all of this broke. And after seeing that the house was empty, aside from the makeshift group of paranormal investigators, so obviously they went round the whole house, Emma reported hearing sounds upstairs when they were all downstairs. A battery apparently appeared beside her out of nowhere, and a spoon appeared on the opposite side of the room. And this is the kind of thing you do sometimes get with poltergeist activity, where these things are called apports, where items sort of appear and disappear and so on. I would also say that I have also seen this kind of thing in fairy activity before, where items will disappear and reappear around the house. So that's where I'm always a little bit I don't want to say dubious, but I'm always like, is it a poltergeist or is it actually something else? We're not really sure. But then with this one, Emma and the other investigators then went upstairs because obviously they could hear all these noises. But then while they were up there, they were the only ones up there, they could then hear footsteps coming up the stairs, and they actually found a pair of sunglasses sitting in the middle of the stairs where there hadn't been a pair before. Now, I couldn't find out much else beyond this, which was really annoying, so I don't know what happened to the house. Apparently Carlisle Housing Association were going to look into it and so on. I don't know what happened to the family. I don't know if somebody else is living there now. It was really difficult to find anything. It's like by September 2007, it just kind of stops. So I'd love to know if the family experienced anything else, if the people who moved in there experienced anything, or if it all just kind of died down. It would be really interesting to know. So if you know anything more about it, then obviously please do feel free to let me know. Before anybody says in the comments as well, none of our children were over the age of like 10. So before anyone goes, oh, it's because of teenagers, I think too many people will just repeat some of the lore about existing poltergeist cases, but I don't think that it's necessarily that helpful, because you do get cases that people describe what sounds like poltergeist activity and there's not even a child present at all. So just putting that one out there. I just think it was a really interesting little snippet there of a ghost story in action that just stops. So it would be really cool to know a bit more about that. As I say, a lot of these stories are quite recent, and our next one is also the same. And this is the Cursing Stone. So in 2001, Carlisle's Chilly House Museum installed a sculpture that was designed by Gordon Young and made by Andy Altman. And they arranged over 300 words from a 1,069 word long 16th century curse on the granite block. So yes, curses in earlier centuries, much, much longer than the kind of thing I think we would come out with. Now, this curse was very specific, and it referenced Carlisle's bloody history with the Reivers, because it was proclaimed by Gavin Dunbar, the then Archbishop of Glasgow, in 1525, and he was basically cursing all manner of criminals, including like robbers and highwaymen and stuff. You can read the curse in its entirety. I will put the link in the show notes. I'm not going to do it here because I don't want to inadvertently, accidentally curse the podcast or anything like that. Because, strangely, installing the sculpture actually seemed to inadvertently curse the city itself, or so people believed. Because 2001 also saw a really awful foot and mouth outbreak that led to the destruction of infected farm stock. I mean, I remember that because we had it over in this side of the country as well, and you could smell the pyres and things. It was horrible, really, really unpleasant. And then Storm Desmond caused widespread flooding of the city in 2005. Various factories closed. A boy was murdered in a bakery. And then the football team dropped a league. And I love the fact that every article feels the need to put that in about Carlisle United. Now, local councillors even proposed destroying or removing the stone, although the financial costs of doing so were basically less of a priority following the devastation from the floods. So you can actually still find the stone in the underpass near the museum. What I do find interesting is the question, was it really a curse or was it all just horrible coincidence? Because many of the problems do seem to end in 2006. So most of the articles that you read about it are from 2006, referring to events in 2001 or 2005. So, yeah. But it's a fascinating idea, though, that, you know, using the words from this curse, which, remember, was against criminals, would then somehow continue to have ramifications. Really, really interesting story. And I also wanted to include a slightly more classical level of story, because like I say, a lot of these have come from the 21st century, but I wanted an older one just to kind of go, oh yeah, there are some. And this one comes from the 18th century. So in the 1760s, notorious highwayman John Whitfield was captured and hung in a gibbet for murder on Barrack Hill along the A6. And it seems they chose that specific spot for the gibbet because it lay near the site where the murder took place. Now, normally dead bodies are hung in gibbets, and they're essentially hung up as like a warning of this is what will happen to you if you commit crime. They generally don't put live people in them. But according to the legend, locals actually heard Whitfield crying in agony. And a coachman apparently passed the gibbet and heard him still mourning a few days later. With little else to do to ease Whitfield's suffering, the coachman shot him to put him out of his misery. And according to legend, people still hear Whitfield's ghost crying for help even now. Now, it should be noted that there was nothing in the record to say that he actually was put in the gibbet while alive, because if anything, the record from St James's Chronicle notes Whitfield, and I quote, was executed at Carlisle and afterwards hung in chains near the place where the fact was committed, end quote. So it doesn't actually say he was put alive, because obviously they mention he was executed and then after put in a gibbet. So it's interesting that the legend preserves he was still alive when the facts would appear to say otherwise. And it's funny how folklore often outlives facts, because people do often prefer stories to actual information. And that is one of the things that I like to explore here on Fabulous Folklore, because a lot of the folklore is really interesting and I love folklore, but you do then think, why did people believe this in the face of actual truth? And I know truth can be subjective, but if a record says this criminal was executed and then put in a gibbet, why does the legend say otherwise? And obviously the record could be wrong, but there we go. Just something to think about. We've got 2 more stories left, and it wouldn't be a city folklore episode without this particular idea of a secret tunnel. But in Carlisle's case, the tunnel is supposed to run, or at least in one of the stories, between the Friars Tavern and the cathedral. And according to Paranormal Database, people hear knockings and other strange sounds coming from the tunnel, thought to be made by whatever travels between the 2 points. Yet elsewhere, other sources say that the passage is only rumoured to exist, with the entrance either secret or having been built over. And then other people think that nobody knows where the tunnel actually comes out from the cathedral, although some people think it emerges in the city walls. And there's also a review of Carlisle Castle on TripAdvisor where the person who'd left the review repeated a legend that the tunnel ran between the castle and the cathedral so that Mary Queen of Scots could go to worship without having to walk around and so on. I have thoughts, and I think one of the things, as far as the idea of Mary Queen of Scots being able to go and worship, that tunnel would have to have pre-existed, because I cannot see that they would build a tunnel underground to allow what is essentially a prisoner to still go to church, bearing in mind Mary was a Catholic in what was at that time a Protestant country. I can't really see that happening because of the sheer expense involved in building a tunnel, so the tunnel would have to already exist for her to be able to use it, as far as I'm basically thinking for that one. And to be honest, it's probably impossible to say if the tunnel exists at all, because so many towns and cities have these legends of tunnels. Even little outlying places have legends of tunnels. And obviously I've covered this before, there's a whole episode about them. And James Wright explores this more in depth in his excellent book, Historic Building Myth-Busting, Uncovering Folklore, History and Archaeology. And James is going to come on the podcast to talk about some of these historic building myths, which I'm really excited about. But in the book, he urges us to consider the practicality of building tunnels. So how would you actually keep them secret for them to be a secret tunnel? And how secret are they if people then talk about them? Where would you put the spoil from digging a tunnel? And how would you actually maintain and ventilate a tunnel? And there's all these practical concerns. So tunnels take a long time to build, and I would think that builders would probably only build what was actually necessary, because obviously they would want to try and save time and cost. And just look at how long it took to build Crossrail with modern technology. So I am a little bit dubious about a lot of these secret tunnel stories. And you do wonder if it's just someone seen a built over door and then gone, ooh, that must have been a tunnel. But I just love the fact that Carlisle also has various secret tunnels as stories as well. But for our last one, because this episode's ended up a lot longer than I was expecting, we're going to have a look at a British big cat sighting. And I've covered them a few times on the podcast. Obviously, there's an entire episode about British big cats. And there's no shortage of sightings of them in Cumbria. And I was quite surprised to hear that the police got 40 reports of sightings between 2003 and 2016, which is actually quite a lot. But then at the same time, seeing them in or around cities sort of feels like a little bit of a surprise, because we'd normally associate them with Bodmin Moor or Exmoor or somewhere like that. But Carlisle has this story from 2012. So again, I'm not that long ago. And I'm hang on, that was 12 years ago. That's actually quite a while. But anyway, on the 4th of August 2012, a man named Raymond Sant apparently spotted an alien big cat. And he described it as being large, black, about the size of a Labrador, but with a long tail. And it was near a wooded area near Asda on Chandler Way. Now, I actually managed to find it on a map, and it's next to the Kingsmoor North Nature Reserve. So it does make sense that if you're going to see a big cat, it would be near somewhere where they could hide. Now, I couldn't find any other reported sightings, either of that animal or one like it in Carlisle itself. Obviously, there's all these other big cat sightings in the rest of Cumbria. However, Sant does admit that he didn't see the head of the animal, so there is still a possibility, as much as he says he knows what he saw, there is still a possibility that he might have actually just seen a dog. But and obviously without further sightings, who knows? And I can't help thinking a slightly more likely explanation is somebody was walking their dog and he's seen the back end of it, and maybe it's been a Labrador crossed with something else, and that's why it's been the size of a Labrador but not quite had the right tail. But without seeing its head, it would be impossible to know what it actually was. But it is really interesting how many big cat sightings do crop up around the country, and I think the one thing that makes me think they're not as prevalent as people think they are, nobody ever comes across like the dead body of a big cat, and you would think that would be something that somebody would notice. So because of that, I do think that a lot of the sightings are probably more likely misidentified animals. I would love it if they were real. I'd love it if they did exist, but I do actually wonder if it is just misidentification, because they're usually seen from so far away and sometimes in slightly odd conditions, so it's not even the person viewing them's fault kind of thing. But these big cats have become part of our folklore, even if no one has definitive proof that they're lurking in the countryside or beside Asda. So what do we ultimately make of these Carlisle legends? And obviously there's lots of other ghost stories, there's lots of other sightings of strange things and so on as well. But obviously, for length, I had to try and pick the ones that I thought would be the most interesting or just different from ones that we've had before. And I think this is a lot that many of the legends do obviously involve ghosts. Obviously I got them from Paranormal Database in the first instance and then went off and investigated further from there. And cities naturally put humans into close proximity, often over spans of centuries. So clearly you're going to end up with after echoes of that, I think. And Carlisle's age and violent history makes it more susceptible than most to stories of hauntings. That these hauntings apparently continue into the 21st century with poltergeist activity is quite interesting though. So who is haunting a Carlisle council house and why? However, I think the additional legends involving the cursing stone, the big cat sighting and the secret tunnels speak to a broader interest in the lore of the city. And I think the cursing stone, which obviously has a reference to Carlisle's history itself, and the cat sighting, while they're both 21st century phenomena, it does place them into the contemporary psychic history of Carlisle. And obviously you also can't have a city without secret tunnel stories as well. So I think that one's quite cool that one's in there. And even if the stories in this episode prove to be utter bunkum, they do add a level of interest and fascination to a city on England's far-flung margins. And like Newcastle upon Tyne, Carlisle does butt up against the northernmost reach of the Roman Empire. It survives the Vikings, it survives the Saxons, it ends up embroiled in Reiver violence. So like my hometown of Newcastle, Carlisle does also house a monarch under arrest. We had Charles I, they had Mary Queen of Scots. So bearing all of that in mind, I would be very surprised if Carlisle didn't have a few legends up its sleeve. So my question that I'm going to leave you with is, have you been to Carlisle? Do you know any of the other legends? And more importantly, do you know anything about any of these stories? Because if you do, please feel free to, you can email me if you want, you can leave a comment on the blog post that this episode is attached to, and as ever, the link is in the show notes below. If you listen on YouTube, just whack a comment straight underneath, and that's obviously the easiest way, I think, to do it, and then that way other people can read them and comment as well as they can on the blog, as I say. Or if you know anything and you don't want to, say it publicly, then the email address is just icy@icysedgwick.com. Please remember, Sedgwick only has one E. And then you can obviously let me know what you know. Just more for my own curiosity more than anything else. I am going to have to wrap this up now, though, because I've just realised that we're already at the half-hour mark, which is way longer than I normally do for these things. But next week we're going to do Sunderland, which a few people were quite surprised about, given I'm from Newcastle, but my dad is actually from Sunderland. And I think Sunderland does get forgotten about quite a lot, and I think it gets ignored, which is really unfair, as most of the North East does. But that's another rant for another time. So yeah, hopefully I will see you next week. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.